off-time roadmap. I'm going to start by going over and defining the terms of the resolution, setting out some parameters for this round, then going into our three contentions. So, starting time. I'd like to thank everybody in attendance. The resolution reads, it is morally unjustifiable to require an individual to join a labor union as a condition of employment. So I'm first going to define the terms. We will define morally as relating to a code of personal actions determined as just in society. This is a Merriam-Webster definition. Unjustifiable, as in not morally right, so it relates back to the first definition. And then the other words are relatively self-explanatory. We'll define labor union as an organized association of workers in a trade or profession to advocate for interests as a communal group. And condition of employment is in you won't be hired if you're not in a labor union. So this is a value round. That we see the word moral in this round. So the weighing mechanism or value criterion in the round would be morality, and our individual value would be liberty. So we're talking about liberty, preservation of individual rights. So in this round, the opposition will choose an opposing value. They'll choose another way where they can achieve morality through this resolution. And so we'll be weighing the two values in this round. I'd just like to clarify before I get into my contentions that in this round, we're not talking about whether labor unions are good or bad. We're not talking about, we're not advocating that labor unions are a bad thing. They're not arguing that they're a good thing. I don't want the debate to come down to that, but instead we're discussing, should an individual be forced to join one? So what are the effects on an individual who may or may not want to join a labor union? And when they're forced to, what happens because of that? Is it an infringement on individual rights? So just to clarify that before the round starts. I'll now go on to our contentions. Just to lay them out, our first is that it's unfair that unions would force dues on workers. Second, that it places the union above the workers when they're forced. And third, that it destroys individual advocative rights. So our first contention is that they're forced dues. Every union forces their members to pay dues. They have to pay dues every month, and with those dues, the union hires lawyers, they talk to lobbyists, they try to get the change that they want. And so it makes sense that they're forcing these dues. However, it's not fair that if an individual does not want to join a labor union but is instead forced to as a condition of employment, that they would have to pay these dues. They'd have to take out a portion of their salary, give that money to the union who may not be advocating for what they want. Many unions are political. They often donate to political campaigns, to lobbyist organizations and things. And so it might go against your individual political beliefs. For example, if you're, I know that the Federation of Farm Workers have been doing a lot of things for Obama. So if someone is a farm worker who may not be for President Obama, then the person is donating money to the labor union who's giving that money to a campaign that they do not support. So these forced dues are inherently bad because the forced dues are not necessarily going towards things that you want. So it makes sense if you're going to pay dues to support your own goals, to support what you need, but if an individual is forced to join a labor union, just regardless of their beliefs, and they don't get any say as to where the money goes, because it's probably just one member in a very large union, then being forced to pay dues is an inherently bad thing, because it doesn't necessarily benefit you and your needs within the union. So our second contention is that it places the union above the workers. Now, a union is not about an individual's needs, but instead of the needs of a group as a whole. Now, once again, I'd like to remind you, we're not saying that unions are bad, but if an individual does not believe that they want to be in a union, that they do not want just to advocate for everybody's needs, but instead of advocate for their own needs, it's bad. Now, if you look at a quote from the former president of the United Federation of Teachers, he stated, quote, when school children start paying union dues, that's when I'll start representing the interests of school children. End quote. So what this shows is that unions are often kind of self-serving. They're just looking for their own advocacy group. So the union of teachers would say, we're teachers. We only want rights of teachers. We're not looking to support children because children are not part of our union. They're not paying members. So they're instead of just supporting the workers, because individual teachers care about the children, they're teaching so that they can support the children. However, when they get into this union, the union is just looking to support their own larger needs of keeping teachers hired, rather than looking at the needs of the children and what's best for society. So they're placing the union above the needs of the individual worker, because they're not looking for what's best in the classroom, but instead just how they can keep everyone hired. So this is bad because it's not necessarily getting the greatest good out there for an individual teacher who's looking to protect the children's rights, or looking for something that they can't advocate for that for themselves, because instead the union is above the workers. And so, they also have to protect the jobs of all employees. This is their second sub-contention. That one of the main jobs of unions is to make sure that nobody is fired unjustifiably. It often makes workers very difficult to fire. And while some people it is justified to fire them. If we look, for example, to a lot of teachers right now, we see a big problem in public schools where teachers have been there for a long time. They're not necessarily using good teaching methods, trying very hard, or even they've actually done bad things. They sexually harass children. They they're doing bad things in their classroom, they're cheating on test scores, and oftentimes because the unions advocate so strongly that these people should not be fired, they stay in the school system. This is another example of how they're placing the union as a whole above the individual, because this doesn't help anyone else in the union if this bad teacher is staying there. Instead, they just have to protect the needs of that teacher. We see that happening a lot in other areas as well, where people cannot be fired from a position at a company, or they cannot, or from somewhere else just because they're unionized. They're placing the union as a whole, that their job is just to protect workers rather than the individual looking, should this individual be fired, does this help the rest of the company? So our third contention is that it destroys individual advocative rights. So when an individual is in a union, they're not allowed to go bargain themselves, they're not allowed to go negotiate their own needs. That's one of the main rules of a union, that you only do those sorts of things through the union activity. That you're not allowed to go up to your boss directly and say, I want a pay raise. You're not allowed to go and say, I think my healthcare plan sucks. I want a better one. Those sorts of things are not allowed in a union. Instead, you bring it to your union representative, who would then bring it to someone higher in the union, who would then decide if it helps the group as a whole. And so, regardless of what you think of this, it's not good for an individual who does not want to join a labor union. If someone takes a job and being in the labor union is a condition of employment, and they want different rights, they think I'm doing more work than my salary is paying me, or I need a different healthcare plan, they're not allowed to advocate for these things for themselves. For example, if there's an individual worker who has some sort of medical condition, if he has, or if he's predisposed to skin cancer or something, and he feels that the medical plan given to him by his employer does not cover that, then he cannot go directly to his employer and discuss the issue, and he instead has to go through the union. And while many of the people in the union may not be affected by that, they may not be predisposed to the same cancer or something, that need is not going to be advocated for. Nobody's going to say that someone needs this if there's a problem with the healthcare plan. Whereas if the individual is not forced to be in a union, they could instead go up to their employer themselves and discuss this issue. This also comes up with salaries, so a lot of people want pay raises, and oftentimes the pay raise is justified. Someone will say, I haven't gotten a raise in 15 years, my work has gone up. But since they're in a union, they cannot advocate for this. They have to stick with the union needs. And the union maybe isn't going to ask for everybody to get a pay raise, because that's a huge amount of money. But if the individual, instead of just go directly to their employer and ask for one pay raise, they're more likely to get that than if they go through the union, and then everyone's like, well, if he's getting a pay raise, I think the entire union should get a pay raise. And then that's less likely to actually happen. So the ending result is the impact of this, of not being able to advocate our individual rights, that is anti-democratic. In a democratic society, we should all get the equal say in what we're doing. However, when we go to unions, we're just building it up so essentially only the union leader really has say over what happens in the votes of the individuals for what they need in their company. This is bad because it sets an anti-democratic precedent where people aren't able to advocate for their own needs, and a larger dictator who would be the union president in a union that you don't want to be in is controlling what you get, is controlling your advocacy, and so you don't get everything you want, you don't get all the needs you want, as shown through examples. So for these reasons, I urge you to vote for the affirmation of this round.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? To provide a brief offline roadmap, first I'll be going over our case and their case. The original resolution we have here today is that it is morally unjustifiable to require an individual to join a labor organization as a condition of employment. We accept our opponent's definitions, and we propose the individual value of fairness as opposed to liberty. Now, the first contention that we have here today concerns collectivity. Now, requiring employees to join a union is fair and reasonable for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is immoral to ask one's co-workers to pay for the union fees and such, and to actually be part of the union, to actually collectively bargain, so that they can actually reap the benefits. Basically, what this means is that if you aren't a part of the union, you still gain the same rights that were fought for by that union. And it is completely unreasonable for this to actually happen, because we live in a world where we pay for and are subject to collective decisions that we would not make on our own. What this basically means is that an individual can't simply just reap all of the benefits that are caused by another collective bargaining group without having to contribute as well. So it is morally unjustifiable for one individual to have these same rights, even though they are not contributing to it at all. Now, to allow everyone to reject to allow somebody to reject these collective decisions is immoral, because it will lead to a world shaped much by power and very little by morality. Now, basically, what this argument means is that we can't actually allow these people to reject a collective decision, just as we can't allow somebody to reject we can't allow somebody to reject speed limits. We can't allow somebody to drive over 25 miles per hour just because they don't want to be forced to. And the same argument much applies here. You can't force somebody to actually have the same benefits as labor union without having them actually take the risks and harms that are associated with labor unions. And as such, it's unfair for my opponents to argue that it is moral for somebody to be a part of labor union but still get the same rights that the labor union guarantees them. My second contention is that basically, yes.
So if someone was in a labor union that, for example, supported a political belief that was not their own, do you think it would be immoral for them not to be paying to support that belief?
Yeah, you're talking about your first contention, right? Yeah, I'll be refuting that in a second. Now, the second contention that we have is that employers deserve the right to actually be able to force basically these union shops. They can require union membership just like they control other business decisions. Requiring union membership is just another way for these employers to basically control their own businesses. They can already enforce health insurance. There's already this hierarchy where employers have power over employees, and forcing union membership is just another moral right that they can actually take away from this hierarchy. Taking away the rights of the businesses to become union shops is actually impermissible. Now, we can see that we're not only talking about the employees here. Employers still reserve the moral right to actually force the businesses to become union shops, and it's unfair for us to take away this right from the employers. And this is a point my opponents have ignored entirely. Now, in addition, employees don't have the inherent right to work wherever they want without the consideration that some businesses have different practices from others. We can't allow different employees to simply go into another business and expect not to be forced into these different unions when some businesses may operate under different moral premises than what other businesses may operate under. Now let's move on to the contentions of the affirmation. The first contention talks about how non-members still have to pay the same dues as union members, and they might go against political beliefs, and they don't necessarily gain the same benefits. Again, our first advantage completely turns this argument because non-members still gain the same rights that regular members do, except they aren't actually part of the collective bargaining group. Therefore, they don't actually contribute anything, but they still gain the same rights, proving that this is inherently immoral because they're not putting in the same amount of work as other people who are fighting for the same amount of rights, striking this first contention off the flow. Their second contention talks about how we put basically labor unions before the individual. They firstly talk about how teacher unions support the teachers and not necessarily the children. Again, this is completely false. Unions don't force teachers in any way to take away from the rights of the children. Unions merely enhance the rights of the teachers themselves, and they also provide no additional examples of how teachers actually being part of a union inherently harms children. The second point in this is that basically you put the union before the individual because you protect workers from being fired. But they go into this ridiculous jump of sexual harassment. How if a teacher is charged with sexual harassment, they can't get fired because the union protects them. Again, this is a completely ridiculous and ludicrous argument because this is an incredibly large leap. If a teacher is charged with sexual harassment, this is directly against the roles of a teacher, and it's also against federal law. So there's really no way unions can actually protect them. And again, even if you don't buy this, Judge, its entire subject is completely irrelevant because it argues whether or not unions are bad or good. It doesn't argue whether or not it's morally permissible to force a union. So again, this entire subject is completely stricken from the flow. Now, third contention, they talk about how, in the third contention, they talk about how an individual can only negotiate as a single union. They can't actually advocate for their own needs. Again, then they argue that this is anti-democratic, and they argue for some reason that unions are inherently a dictatorship. This is completely untrue. Unions are inherently democratic because they're formed of individuals who are peers among each other who inherently fight for their own rights. And unions, by themselves, are inherently democratic because they force people to actually come together as a collective group and fight for their needs, just as any real democratic political system would actually work. So to suggest that being unable to negotiate as an individual and instead negotiate as a union is inherently false, because unions still support the same rights. Unions still support collective bargaining. They always fight for higher wages, which is something that any real employee would actually want. They fight for better health insurance benefits. They fight for benefits in general, and as such, unions actually fight for the same rights that much of the individuals want. And to suggest that it's anti-democratic and that unions are headed by one single dictator who basically controls the entire union is inherently false. So since our first advantage already turns our since our first contention entirely turns our first contention, and we basically strike the second and third contention from the flow, let's move on one more time to briefly clarify what this debate is actually about. As my opponents have already stated, we're not arguing today whether or not labor unions are good or bad. We're debating whether or not it is morally justifiable to force an individual to become part of a labor union. And as such, much of their arguments already fall from the flow, as I already stated before. The second contention, they talk about how unions prevent workers from being fired. Again, there's really no reason this works there's really no reason why the second contention has any real weight in today's debate, because they argue that unions are bad. They don't argue that it is unpermissible for somebody to force somebody to join a union, and as such, again, there's no real weight in that argument. Now, in their third contention, they talk about how individuals can negotiate as one. They can only negotiate as a union, but again, unions are in dictatorships. You can't have a single union leader who mandates everything that a union does, because unions, again, are inherently democratic.
Just to clarify our second contention, I was trying to argue that because they place a group over an individual, the individual should be able to choose whether they should be part of that group. They should be able to make the decision whether they want their needs advocated for on the larger scale, not just arguing that unions are bad.
It's not really a question.
It was a clarification.
Oh, all right. Okay, thank you, I guess. But that doesn't really change the fact that, again, the entire premise of the second contention is that the arguing for the morality of unions is not the morality of forcing somebody to be in the unions. And as such, as I've already said before, it doesn't hold any weight. Now, because there are two contentions, and the fact that we've refuted the three contentions completely, I refer both in the negation. Thank you. Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay.
first off, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. It's been a good debate. To provide a brief roadmap, I'm the first to go over our opponent's case, then I'll go over our own. Okay, so I'll start off with their first contention of collectivity. This is probably the core of where the debate comes down to. Their points about how the individual should be working for the benefit of others, or our points about how the individual should be working for his own benefit. It really comes down to freedom of the individual, or taking away freedoms of the right of the individual for other people. Now, I'd like to point to the actual resolution in this round, and it actually states, is it justified to require a individual? So the resolution itself is focusing on the individual. It is not focusing on the group, it is just focusing on the individual. Is it morally justifiable for this individual to be forced to join a union? Now, when you look at this point of collectivity, it really goes against freedom. In the United States and in many countries, freedom is one of the things that is one of the most important values that we uphold in our society. It's really a value that states that any group should not force an individual to join their group for the benefit of their group when that individual does not feel they should do so, does not support that other group, does not support this group. So this point about collectivity, it really goes against this point of liberty, which is really a more important value than collectivity, because this point of liberty is what really defines our society, and this point of liberty is actually where all morals flow, from this point of liberty. Secondly, when you're saying it's not fair for an employee to not join a union because maybe a union might suffer, if a union is suffering and the employee is not part of this union, the individual is not part of this union, why is there a union at all if the union is not helping the individuals? Secondly, there's a point brought up about speed limits, about how we force individuals not to drive too fast. However, this is actually not a good point, because this is totally different from what we're arguing. A speed limit is something that the United States puts on its citizens because it is saying that you are endangering people if you drive too fast. However, under different decisions, like the Supreme Court's decision on Citizens United, the Supreme Court has said that individuals have the power of the purse, in which case they express their freedom through how they spend their money. So when you're spending your money, this is a totally different issue, because you're being forced to spend your money into a union. Yes.
Can you please go back to your refutation and explain how not being able to get the benefits is fair for the union? Fair for the people, and how if the union fails, then it doesn't matter. Like you just basically stated previously that the union failing meant that it wasn't protecting the rights of its workers, and therefore it didn't matter. Could you go back to that point and re-explain it?
Well, is it not true that part of the point about fairness is that you're saying if everyone is suffering, if the group is suffering, then if this union is suffering, then everyone is suffering, is part of your point about fairness, right? Now, if everyone is suffering in a union, why is there a union at all, and why doesn't each individual advocate for his or her own rights? So really what we're saying is that through this issue of collectivity, you're really taking away people's individual rights and their liberty, and then what you're having a group defining what the individual should be doing, which really it goes against everything we hold dear, because now we have a group and it is defining what each single person does and says and advocates for. And this really ties right into our second contention about unions often being self-serving, about the union often working more for itself than for the individual person. Next, I'll go into the contention about employers deserving the right. Now, really, this isn't actually a contention in itself, just because employers have this right. They really never explain why they have this right, or why they should deserve this right. We are saying that employers shouldn't deserve this right of forcing their employees to join a union. That's really the point of the debate, is that we are arguing this. We're saying that employers don't deserve this right because the individual should be able to choose whether or not to join a union. It's like if you were going to go to a bank and you wanted to have a job as a bank teller, and then the bank required you to have a bank account at this bank. This shouldn't happen. It may happen. You may want to take out a bank account. You may want to join a union, but you shouldn't be forced to. You shouldn't be forced to advocating for views you don't believe in. And so with that, I'll transition to our first contention about the forced dues. So really, this is the core of the debate where, as I stated, the Supreme Court has illustrated that people have expressed their freedom through the money they spend. So when you're spending money, that's an expression of liberty. And when you're forced to spend your money in a certain direction, that is a suppression of liberty. So these forced union dues, and if an individual can only get a job because of this, and they're required to pay these dues, that is a suppression of liberty. I still have a lot to get through, I'm sorry. So every union forces people to pay dues, and this is unfair because now you're paying dues that you don't believe in. For example, many unions are actually very close to political parties. So a union might be advocating for, they might be spending money to a political campaign. For example, a union might be spending money for the Romney campaign. However, you as the individual don't believe Romney should become president. You as the individual don't believe Romney should become president. However, under this forced dues, you are, through the union, advocating for Romney becoming president. You are spending money for something you don't believe in. You are spending money for Romney to become president because that's the union wants, even though that's not what you want. So really, we see that often this becomes a suppression of democracy itself, because the person through the union is advocating oftentimes for political candidates they might not even believe in. So not only are we seeing liberty suppressed, but also democracy itself. Next, we have the point of unions are often self-serving. This kind of ties into the issue of collectivity. Now, as my partner stated, there are obvious cases of when the union puts itself above, puts the benefit of the union and the people in it above actually what the workers are producing and what the individual wants. So a union suppresses your ability to go and talk directly to your employer, and it often takes these dues and makes it so the union benefits and not necessarily the individual. You may not benefit from a union's decision, but yet you're required to advocate for it through the money you spend. And the last is destroys individual advocacy rights. This is very tied to the political parties issue, where you are no longer allowed to advocate for what you believe in. So what we see is that when an individual is required to join a labor union, their liberty is suppressed. And this is a core moral issue because a lot of morals stem from liberty. A lot of what you believe in and what you hold dear and the values you have stem from your freedom to express them and stem from your democratic ability to vote for people you believe in. So this is such a key issue because this is really what makes America great, and it's what makes individuals unique, and what makes I would strongly argue that you should vote for the affirmation. Thank you.
Sorry, I think that's the speaking order of ODowd.
Oh, Pearl is first.
Alright.
For a brief roadmap, our case, their case. So our first let's go over the value that we provide with topic case issues. So the value that we provide is that of fairness. Fairness is a preferable value to that of liberty, because when evaluating whether or not an individual can or should be forced to join a labor union, we should evaluate whether or not it's fair for them and also fair for the employer to have this right. Because this is a dual relationship. We have to evaluate the value both for the employer and for the person involved in this. It's really early, so maybe I'll take later on what side we're talking. Okay. So moving on to their actual refutation, we're going to brought up to our first contention regarding that of collectivity. So first, our basic point for that of collectivity was that by requiring employees to join a union is fair and reasonable, because what the union does and what the union works for ends up affecting every single employee within that business, regardless of whether they're in the union or not. Therefore, if they're getting all these benefits that the union gives to their the employees of that company, it is immoral and unfair for to ask one's coworkers to pay for these benefits that the other people are not paying for. Therefore, since we can see that, yes.
Wouldn't you concede that for the individual, liberty is more important than fairness?
We must understand that fairness is more important because as long as it's a fair and just society, people are benefiting from all the actions that are taken. But the moment that fairness is thrown away and fairness is not valued as a value, and then we see that society actually ends up breaking down as a result of this. So now let's move on to continue moving on. I've just taken one, maybe later. So now moving on to the next part of their refutation to us. Basically, they said that they cannot force them to join. This is not fair. This is not giving them liberty. But it is fair because basically, in order to do this, you must also factor in all the other individuals that are in the union who are working for that company, and also the employees that are in that company as well, and also the fact that in this, basically, collectivization is important because if we allow people to reject collective decisions, basically, we are no longer working through a fair, moral-based system. We're working through whoever has the most power gets what they want. This is not a fair system, and this is not even liberty, which operates under their own value. So basically, you can see that our contention works under both our value and their value. Because what a society that is dictated by power and not by morality is one that is against liberty and against fairness. So therefore, you can, whether you believe our value or their value, it is clear that for the individual and for the employer and for the group as a whole, collectivity is the most important thing. Let's move on to the next refutation, where they said, which really didn't make much sense. We said if everyone in the union is failing, then why is there a union in the first place? But the point is that the union wouldn't be failing because people are going to be working together in order to ensure that they get the most benefits. And secondly, it's only talk about whether a union is good or bad, and not whether it's moral or not. So therefore, you must discard this reputation for firstly because it's false, secondly because it doesn't matter. Next, let's move on to our second contention regarding the fact that employers deserve the right to force these conditions upon their employees. Now, what we must understand is that the company is a hierarchical structure. We have the employers who are giving these employees their jobs. If they do not like the rules that this employer puts on these people, they can simply find another company in which the employer does give these people what they want. So now, they bring up the point that the employer should not have the right to do this. The people should be able to have freedom of association wherever. Now, basically, this actually ties into our side because if people do not want to work at this company where they have to have these unions and they're forced to join these unions in order to be there, they can simply go work at another company. They're not forced to join this company, and they're not forced to join this labor union if they don't want to, because they can simply join another company. Now, this is not an obligation to force them to join labor unions. We're simply giving the employer the right, if they wish to, in order to force them to join a labor union. Yes?
Considering this debate, just looking at the resolution is framed from an individualistic perspective as an individual, don't you think that liberty is preferable to fairness? Because if you're just looking at yourself, you want to advocate for your own rights, rather than looking at the large-scale fairness, because we're just looking at the individual level.
I already responded to your question. It's literally the same one your partner asked me 2 minutes ago. Now, moving on, and to avoid wasting time, let's move on to the other links that I provided in the actual impacts on this. Basically, we're showing that by refuting their own justifications, which they should not have the right, and I proved conclusively that the employer has a right to do this, and secondly, that the individual doesn't like it, he can simply go to somewhere else, he can simply go to another company, which also works in the value of liberty and the value of fairness, because they can still have the choice to work wherever they wish. As long as they can still work at another company if they wish to, which allows them to have the value of liberty and the value of fairness. So let's move down straight to the links and show how we clearly win on this argument. So now, basically, my partner stated that they can require the union membership like they have other control over business matters. And if, in the status quo, if people do not like other business decisions these companies are making, they simply don't have to join this company. This is how the status quo works right now. And understanding this, we can see that employers have this right, and they deserve this right also, because it basically follows a hierarchical structure, and that is what is fair. So now, let's move on to their case and show how we clearly went to the debate. So our first contention was that of having to pay dues is not fair for this individual. However, we have turned this argument by showing it's not fair for the collective group, and it's not, as a result, this is the most important thing, because basically they are not, if this person is getting all the benefits that come as a result of this union membership, but they don't have to pay for it, that shows a fundamental unfair nature of this, because of the fact that they're getting all these benefits and they don't have to do anything for them. Now, opponents had to refute this by saying that basically this is an expression of liberty, and by whether or not to join a union is an expression of liberty, and therefore they should be able to keep this liberty. But what we misunderstand is they can simply work somewhere else. We are not forcing them to work at this company, and then as a result, it's forcing them to join the union as well. They can simply work in another place where the union, forcing them to join a labor union is not required, which means that their liberty is not being taken away. And also, this is fair, because if they do decide to work this company, they have to do the same things that these other people are doing in order to have a fair and just society. Moving on to their second contention, regarding the fact that it puts the union over workers. Now, my opponent did not respond to our second refutation. This talks about unions are good or bad, and as a result, this does not matter. So we might misunderstand. So you must strike this contention from the flow automatically, and no matter what they say, it does not matter since they did not touch on the morality of this point whatsoever during this, the member of government speech. Therefore, this contention doesn't matter anymore. But let's say that you believe that they did. Now, they stated that in refutation to our first refutation, and it puts the benefits of the union and the people in it first. Now, what we misunderstand is that my opponent during his speech said that they put the benefit of the union and the people in it first. Therefore, since the individual within the union is one of the people within the union, is indeed benefiting from this, and as a result, it's actually good for the people, and as such, so even if you do believe that unions are good or bad actually matters in this round, it's actually good for the people there. So now let's move on to their third contention regarding the fact that they can only negotiate through the union. Now, as my partner already stated, this is an issue of whether it's good or bad, and it's not morality. My opponent also did not respond to this point here, so therefore this condition must be stricken from the flow. But also, let's say that you actually, let's move on to the anti-democratic part of it. Now, my partner responded to this by saying that basically, since they are going for the rights of people within the union, they are indeed being democratic and they're arguing for the things that they wanted. My opponent just basically had the same burst, liberty suppressed, But as I'm trying to point out, they're actually supporting liberty and supporting fairness by going with what the people in the labor union want. Therefore, I strongly urge a vote in litigation. Thank you.
Alright, judge is ready.
Alright. What's your order?
First I'll be going over, I'll go over our case, their case, and voting issues. Alright. Now let's go line by line in my opponent's on our case and see how our impacts matter in today's debate. Now the first contention we have is collectivity. Again, our opponents kind of misinterpret this contention, but what we're basically trying to say with collectivity is that it's immoral for somebody to pay. It's not immoral for a certain group, such as the union, to pay for these rights, to pay for these benefits, to pay for these higher pay, to pay for these higher wages, and to allow non-union members to actually gain the same benefits that paying union members gain. Again, we can liken this to the way the United States government actually works. In America, United States citizens pay certain taxes to gain the benefits enjoyed by citizenship. Again, if you don't pay the taxes, then you should not deserve the rights gained by citizenship. And this argument can much be likened to the same argument about unions. It is morally permissible for an employer to actually force a non-union member to become a union member, because that way they can pay for the same rights that union members gain, and they don't actually gain the same rights that union members gain without paying. And this is the essential argument of collectivity. If we look at both values of liberty and fairness, it's unfair for somebody to pay for these rights, to not pay for these rights, gain them. And on the liberty side, it's basically liberty, freedom is only freedom if it doesn't infringe upon somebody else's freedom. So if person A doesn't actually pay for these same benefits, then they shouldn't deserve the same freedoms that are enjoyed by these people, because they basically send out their money for the rights of from person A, but the person A doesn't actually contribute at all. Now, the second contention that we have is basically that employers still deserve the right to run the company the way they want. It is an essential moral right of an employer to set their own parameters for how an employee should work under that company. Again, my opponents misinterpret this basically, but what we're trying to say is that employers still reserve the same rights to run the business the way they want to. Employers can force employees to get health insurance. Employers are basically higher in the hierarchy than employees actually are, and as such, it doesn't make sense that these people, that the affirmative denies employers the right to run the business they actually want, the way they actually want to, and as such, again, basically takes away the rights from the employers, and this is something that was completely dropped by my opponents. Now let's go over their case line by line and explain why it doesn't really work in today's debate. Now the first contention we basically turn with our own advantage, with our own contention. The fact that we have to pay dues is actually fair, because you enjoy the same rights that are taken from paying these dues. The second contention, they talk about how unions put themselves over the actual workers. And they start talking about teachers, but again, this doesn't really make sense. We're not talking today, again, about why unions are good or bad. We're talking about whether it is fair to force these people into unions. In addition, unions, they keep labeling unions as self-serving. But we must understand that even if unions are self-serving, it's in the individual's advantage to actually have unions be self-serving. Unions are solely comprised of individuals. They can't label unions as organizations that only fight for their own rights, because when a union fights for its own rights, it fights for the individual's rights as well. And this is what makes unions morally permissible, and this is what makes forcing people into unions morally permissible. Now, the third contention, they talk about how individuals can only negotiate through unions, but again, this is much the same contention as the second one, and the reputation still can be cross-applied. So let's move on to the first voter's issue. That is my opponent's misinterpretation of today's topic. Now, throughout both of their speeches, they keep talking about the pros and cons of unions specifically. Again, they in their own first speech entitled the fact that this debate is whether or not unions are good, whether or not forcing people into unions is good or bad, not whether or not unions are good or bad. But then they again and again say that unions are self-serving. They talk about how unions protect themselves over individuals. These are all arguments over why unions are good or bad, and they really still have no way in today's debate. And even if you as a judge believe that they do, we still will adequately refute them. Yes.
So considering that if an individual believes that the union is not working for their own individual needs, but instead the needs of a larger group, shouldn't the individual morally be able to make the decision not to join that union under that premise?
Well, the issue with that entire argument is that you believe that individuals have such contrastingly different views from actual unions that they are actually forced to go against what they actually believe. Yes.
But in the resolution, it's inherent that the individual is questioning whether or not they want to join the union. The individual doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, I'll talk about that next. I'll look at the original wording of the resolution. It is morally unjustifiable to require an individual to join a labor organization as a condition of employment. We're not talking, again, my opponents seem to have misinterpreted this topic by assuming that it's only talking about the individual. But we're not only talking about the individual, we're talking about the people affected by this individual. So let's propose another example. Well, let's assume that individuals can reserve the right not to join a labor union. But then the 99 other people that say that are part of a labor union, that pay the same dues, that fight for the same rights, still enjoy these rights, but this person actually abuses these other people by not paying the same amount of money for the same amount of rights. So again, person A and not being forced to join a labor union is in the moral wrong. Additionally, the employer still doesn't get the same rights that they actually deserve because they can't actually operate under a hierarchy, and they can't actually operate the moral needs that they have, the moral rights they have to operate a business how they actually want. And again, person A not joining this labor union, not being forced to join this labor union, is in the moral wrong again. So we're not necessarily talking about just the individual. This is something my opponents have misinterpreted. We're talking about the fact that this individual not being forced to join the labor union affects a far larger amount of people. And we're talking about preserving the larger rights of people, the larger rights of the people in the labor union. We're talking about preserving the rights of the employers, not necessarily just this one individual. We can't focus on this one individual. So let's move on to the second voter decision. That is about fairness versus liberty. Again, there's really no reason for this argument to have any real place in the first place because their liberty argument doesn't really make sense. When we're talking about labor unions, we're talking about the collective whole. We're talking about this individual. We're talking about whether it's fair or not to have one individual's rights over a collective whole. And as such, this voter decision really doesn't. This voter decision really works for our side, and liberty doesn't really work for their side either. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not going to go over individual points, I'm just going to clarify two things, and then I have three voter issues. So, starting time. The first thing I want to talk about is just to clarify two things in this round. The first is that I want to talk about, something they've made a really big deal in the last two speeches. They've been talking about, well, if the individual doesn't want to support the union, why are they joining that company? Now, first, this was not a really big point in their first speech, so we didn't have time to respond to this earlier, which is why I'm talking about it now. But they talk about, that's not really what the resolution is talking about. Their argument is, well, if the individual doesn't support the union's needs, why are they at the company at all? But the resolution really questions whether or not, assuming the individual is at that corporation, should they be forced to join the union at that corporation? It's kind of irrelevant in this round to what we're talking about, the morality of having to join the union. We're not just talking about how they can go to another business and join a different union. And we're also talking about the liberty of having joined any union in general. So the second thing I want to clarify is when talking about our second contention, they've said it many times that we're just saying that unions are bad through the second contention. I just want to clarify that we were saying that because unions inherently argue the group over the individual, this is bad for an individual who does not believe in the union's needs. So it's regardless of whether unions are good or bad, if someone does not believe that they want their needs advocated for as a group, they should not be forced to have their needs advocated for in this way. This is the purpose of the contention. When I was giving examples of how sometimes unions don't comply with individuals' needs, that was just proving the point that there's a reason for an individual not to want to join the union, and that they should have this moral choice because of those problems. So now we're moving on to voter issues. The first is the issue of democracy, second, collectivity, and third, fairness versus liberty, so an evaluation of how our value criterions affect how our values affect value criterion in this round. So first I want to talk about the democracy, because we've had opposing claims here. Now, on the affirmation, we say that forcing individuals joining unions is anti-democratic because they're forced to support things they don't believe in. Now, the opposition teaches this very democratic because these unions advocate for their needs. However, I believe that you lose the democracy within unions when you force individuals to join them, because you're no longer choosing to advocate for your own needs, you're just being forced to advocate for the needs of a greater party. And so, because you're forced into the union. Now, my partners talk a lot about how money affects politics. So when you give dues to this union, they go a lot to other political parties, to greater political schemes, trying to advocate to pass bills to help your company as a whole. But an individual may not want this. Now, the opposition has never addressed this claim. We've talked about this in every single speech, how oftentimes in unions, they give a lot of money to outside organizations, to political campaigns and things. They have never addressed this. This is a really important issue now because this affects first collectivity and second democracy. This came under the point of democracy. Money affects politics. They never contended this. So paying a big amount of money to a company you don't believe in inherently supports the beliefs of that body. I'll take your point.
Considering the fact they can join another company which supports another union which could support their political beliefs, why does it matter if they why can't they just join that company?
Thank you. Now I talked about this before, but if you look back to the resolution, it's to an individual to join a labor union as a condition of employment. So if they're going to be employed at this company, should they have to join the labor union at that company? It's questioning whether an individual should have to join that union. So even past it, they never responded to this argument under any of the, we've talked about this under a lot of different contentions. They never discussed it. So this counts for the affirmation side. This doesn't really support liberty or fairness, that individuals should have to put all this money towards a campaign or a political belief they don't support it. So you can just put this on the app side, absolutely, when you're voting in this round. It's really important for both democracy and collectivity, which I'm talking about now. So in terms of collectivity, you must consider this resolution on an individual level. Now, yes, it discusses the company as a whole, but it's talking about, is it morally justifiable for this individual? Is this a moral decision? Does it support liberty or fairness on the individual level as a condition of employment? So, they also didn't discuss how it hurts they discussed how it hurts the individual, not how it hurts the union as a whole. And so, what they didn't talk about is, as an individual, when they're not forced to be in union, if they feel they can more articulately or more specifically advocate for their own needs, they should have that right. Regardless of whether or not you feel that an individual not joining is kind of copping out of the union, we're looking to the individual level, how does this support the individual, not how does it support the company as a whole? Because the resolution here was specifically framed to question the individual, not is it morally justifiable for a company to force labor unions, but is it morally justifiable for the individual who's inherently questioning whether or not they want to join the labor union to do this. And it is not justifiable because the individual may want to advocate for their needs. Which brings me to my last thing, fairness versus liberty. Now, here, it's inherent in the resolution that the individual does not necessarily want to join the labor union, they're not kind of gung-ho about this, they're questioning it, and so whether or not someone who doesn't necessarily want to join a union should be forced to join a union. And so this is where fairness and liberty kind of contrast. So even if you don't buy the collectivity issue, you need to look to the values, because the values kind of clarify that for you. We're going to talk about the rights and the morality on the employer, but instead on the individual level. So considering this debate is evaluated on the individual, you should look to liberty over fairness. I'll explain to you how we've won this on both fronts. I'm sorry, I'm not taking another point right now. So you need to. We asked for this clarification. Why exactly is fairness better for the individual than liberty? My partner asked this, then I asked it again. He kind of shot me down saying my partner had already asked us because I wanted clarification. They never specifically stated why fairness is more important on an individual level than liberty. But we believe that, looking at this in terms of liberty, we need to look. Liberty is more important for an individual to have because it's about individual rights and advocating your own needs, whereas fairness applies more to the group as a whole. And they only provide examples of times when. Of the specific benefits of fairness, not the consequences of unfairness. So why necessarily is it bad for a company to have unfairness within? So they never explain it. So I urge you to vote for the affirmation in this round.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for judging. Judging.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Would you like us to? Would you argue to stay, or would you like to step out of the room?
You guys don't have to step out unless.
No, you guys should say the job.
First, you go first.
I'll let you go first.
All right. Let's see. I'll start with my decision. I affirmed in this round, and let me explain why. And let me preface this by saying that I hate value debates. I think that they're really easy to just absolutely throw a whole mess on there and leave very little evaluation criteria for me as a judge, and that very frequently the wrong evaluation starts to happen because naturally as debaters we tend to debate in a more policy format. So a lot of the arguments, and both sides pointed this out at one another, that a lot of the arguments that come out are union good-bad rather than union moral-immoral. So I think that a lot of issues come out in value rounds for that specific reason. So with that in mind, when I look to... Yeah.
Do you think there would have been any way to get this out of being a value round?
Personally, I forgot to write this in my paradigm, and I should have, to be fair. I don't know if you guys even bother reading paradigms, but I don't believe in the tricot at all. And that's because I went to Claremont's debate camp with John Meany, and John Meany is like this genius debater who was literally around when the plan was invented. Like, before him, there was no plan in debate. Like, that's how ancient this dude is. And he says that in any round, there are policy, value, and factual implications of every resolution. So you have the ability to debate with all of those arguments, and you don't even really need to specify. You just give the criterion by which you wish to have the round weighed, and then you debate around that and bring your arguments back, find a way to link back to that criterion. So what I would have said is, I would have just gone straight up, you know what, Judge? I know this reads kind of similar to a value, but it has policy implications. It has the implication that the United States federal government would place a ban on labor organizations, or that, you know, the globe would unite against labor organizations, or something like that, or in the state of California we would unite against them. So I would just say that there are policy implications, and then change it over to policy. And that might not work with parent judges, but a lot of college judges would be so relieved that you weren't giving them a value round that they would just say, okay, I believe that, go on. You know, so I think that really all you need, just the key word is implications. Because I'll vote on that every time. Because I think that there are implications associated with this, and that you get into that sort of in the round, because your opponents start talking about, you know, the implications of not having closed shops, and what that means for the unions. Specifically in their first contention, we're talking about about employees gaining benefits that they're not paying for through dues. So I think that you can really easily do that. But getting back to my RFD, hold on, let's see, how am I doing on time? Oh god, 2 minutes, all right. So when I start looking to the actual evaluative debate that occurs, the affirmative does a lot more of tying back to morality, specifically in the third contention. It was one of the only times I've heard it in debate, is you tying your value to morality, which you said is the main value we're supposed to be evaluating here, and you wanted to evaluate that through liberty. That was one of the only times in the round that I heard your actual argumentation tied back to the value that we're supposed to be looking at for the round. And that's one of the critical reasons for my decision. But then furthermore, I buy a lot of the argumentation that comes out later in the round from the affirmative that not joining that company is not in the question. Like, that's not what we're debating today. We're debating the morality of that specific situation where if a person wishes to work for this company, but they are required to join this labor organization, are they being morally screwed by the company or by the union as it stands? And just for the record, for future rounds, when you have a situation where there's a requirement to join a union, it's not as a result of the employer. Frequently, employers don't want there to be unions. It's as a result of a closed shop policy on behalf of the union itself, where it says, we'll go on strike if you hire someone who doesn't join our union. So that does create different implications, because kind of your second contention, if your opponents had just pointed that out, would have fallen entirely, because it's not as a result of the hierarchy of the company, it's as a result of all of the other employees saying, oh, well, we won't come to work if you hire that one person. So you can have one employee or 30 employees who are a little more expensive. Essentially, my vote boils down to that I saw more tying back to actual morality on their side, and a lot of your refutations stem from the fact that, oh, well, the employee can just go somewhere else. But when they bring forward that argumentation that that's not really what the resolution is asking us to question, which I buy, at the point where you don't provide argumentation on that, then it kind of leaves you open to having all of those refutations fall, and then essentially I'm left with what they said on it, so they just wind up winning more points in their favor when you don't provide more analysis on that. So when someone brings up something about resolutionally non-plussing your arguments, you really need to go back and say why resolutionally your arguments are relative, or relevant, sorry. A little bit over time, but there we go.
So I ended up voting App, ODowd, and I went there mainly due to the fact, similar to my other judge, is if you guys got the resolutionality of the issue, that is an individual base instead of collective base. Now, there's one big problem I had this entire round. You guys set the parameters pretty well, and you're like, we're not looking at this good or bad, and I'm like, cool. But you don't get to the entire idea of individuality until your very last speech, and that's really, really dangerous. They actually are winning throughout most of this round due to the fact that they can keep impacting back their value of fairness. But you check back to that when you say in the resolution itself, it's individual, and they're looking at the union as a whole. So that solves back for that. You guys see that have that out in your parametrics block. If you guys have that out in your parametrics, that will wipe out any one of their contention that can be put down on that. They have to completely structure a new value based on your case. And on the two, I think you need to impact back to your value more. Like, you do a lot of really good line by line, you have a lot of really good stats, and you don't ever impact your value though. If you, like, say, turn on their first contention on collectivity, this doesn't impact liberty, this doesn't impact fairness, we do it better, we capture that. That gives her so much more than she can work with it in her rebuttal speech. On you guys, I really think, it's not that I don't like your intentions, I just think you guys reached a little far with the entire idea of this impacting the union. I think if you guys, once again, need a little more work on top for your parametrics, if you're going to parametricize down to the union and impacting the individual through the union, like, on your collectivity issue, I really like that idea, saying that, like, you know, the issue of the union itself impacts the individual inherently. You guys need to get that first and foremost. Say the union is the individual is the union, no matter what, they're inseparable. That, which I back anything you have to say. On the second contention on employers' rights, I think you guys are really running a dangerous contention there because you're advocating for a hierarchy. And in your first contention, you said, well, issues based on power aren't good because they take away liberty. But in your second contention, you're saying, well, this employer-based hierarchy based on the power to give or deny unions is good. So I think, I mean, you guys get away with actually going to attack it, but you know, just be careful when writing contentions when you go really critical on the ideas. Yeah, pretty much everything my other judge had to say across points there. Well, I'll just add a little extra. Do you guys have any questions for us or anything?
No.
No.
Thank
There
you.
are a few last things I wanted to get out that I forgot to read. These are on the ballot as well. For first speaker, I believe it was opposition. At one point, you tell Pearl that her POI wasn't a question. It doesn't actually have to be a question, it can be a comment as well.
Yeah,
So I know it's awkward to respond to them when they're just comments, so usually what I go is, thank you, and then just jump back into it because it's just faster, so you save yourself a few more seconds and get a few more words into your speech. And then when you do your rebuttal, spend it on voters. He just gave a speech about all of those issues, and I mean, you did good work, it was good things to have in there, but he also did a good job. So I think that you have your time better spent just spending it on voters because your partner's good, so you don't need to worry about doing his job for him. Voters really are pretty critical, especially in a value round, which is really unfortunate because when there's no real thing for me to weigh on really heavily, then it's better to spend your time just telling me why I'm voting for you. For ODowd, Achinelli, I thought that you could signpost clearer in your speech. And I've seen you signpost a lot more in other speeches, so I don't know if you're just having an off day or something with your signposting, but giving me a little more structure when you're speaking is going to let me flow you a little bit better, which always works out in your favor because then I get more of your words on paper. So just be careful with that. Kind of try to internalize signposting, and you can do that by re-giving old speeches and then just emphasize your signposting, and it'll start to become really natural. And then my very last thing, sorry, you guys can get out of here in 1 second. Konath. Relatively, how you pronounce it, I'm not sure.
Close enough.
When you respond to her POI, there was one moment where you started to get a little bit snarky, and you just need to be really careful with that because it didn't really impact you as far as I'm concerned for the round, but there are a lot of judges, particularly when you go to state or any tournament like that, you're going to have a lot of parent judges. State is mostly parent judges, and parent judges have no idea how to vote. So courtesy is one of the only things they can figure out to vote on. So just be super careful about that because good teams like yourself shouldn't drop over something stupid like that. So just don't put yourself in that position where a parent judge is going to drop you over something that simple. You know, you want to win on actual things rather than let your opponents win on the only thing that the parent judge could figure out. You know what I mean? But really good job, you guys. I love this tournament. I get to see good teams.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.